Hey everyone, welcome back to Gen Z Unfiltered, the podcast where we break down global affairs without putting you to sleep. I'm your host Arunima, and today we're talking about a place that most people couldn't point out on a map, but that could potentially spark one of the biggest international crises of our generation. If you hadn't guessed already, yes, it's called the South China Sea. Now, when you hear sea, you might imagine beaches, islands, and vacation destinations. But this sea is different. In fact, some experts have called it one of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth. Why? Because several countries claim ownership of it. Military ships regularly patrol its waters, and two global superpowers, the United States and China, are increasingly competing for influence there. So today, we're answering one question: why is everyone fighting over a sea? Let's get into it. What even is the South China Sea? First things first, the South China Sea is a body of water located between China and several Southeast Asian nations, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. At first glance, it doesn't seem particularly special, but here's where things get interesting. Around one third of global maritime trade passes through these waters. Think about that. Many of the products we use every day, from smartphones to clothing to electronics, travel through these shipping routes. If trade in the South China Sea were seriously disrupted, the effects could be felt across the globe. So, this isn't just a regional issue, it's a global one. Second, why are countries fighting over it? The main issue is territory. China claims a large portion of the South China Sea through what is known as the Nine Dash Line. However, countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei also claim parts of the same waters. Imagine several students in a classroom all claiming ownership of the same desk. That's essentially what's happening, but with islands, reefs, and strategic waterways. The problem is that these claims overlap, and when claims overlap, tensions rise. Moving on, let's look at the importance of tiny islands. Now, here's something strange. Many of the disputed features aren't even proper islands. Some are reefs, some are tiny rocks, some are barely visible above water. So, why do countries care so much? Because under international law, controlling an island can give a country rights over nearby waters and resources. And these resources matter. The South China Sea is believed to contain significant oil and natural gas reserves, as well as some of the world's richest fishing grounds. In other words, it's not really about the islands, it's about what the islands provide access to. Enter the superpowers. If this were only a disagreement between neighboring countries, it would already be complicated. But then, the United States of America enters the picture. The United States doesn't claim territory in the South China Sea. However, it argues that international waters should remain open to everyone. As a result, the US regularly conducts naval operations in the region. China sees some of these actions as interference. The US sees them as defending freedom of navigation. And that's where things become dangerous, because when military ships and aircraft from rival powers operate close to one another, misunderstandings can happen. And in geopolitics, misunderstandings can escalate very quickly. Now, for the most important part: why does this matter to Gen Z? Why does this matter to us? At this point, you might be thinking, okay, cool, but how does this affect me? That's a fair question. The answer to that is globalization. The world is more connected than ever. The phone in your hand may contain components manufactured in multiple countries. The clothes you wear may have traveled through international shipping routes. The food you eat may depend on global trade networks. If a major conflict disrupted trade through the South China Sea, prices around the world could increase. Supply chains could be affected, and economies everywhere could collapse and feel the impact. What happens in one region doesn't stay in one region anymore. Moving on, let's look into the Philippines and international law. One of the most important moments in this dispute happened in 2016. The Philippines brought a case against China to an international tribunal. The tribunal ruled that China's extensive maritime claims had no legal basis under international law. China rejected the ruling. And here's where things get really interesting. The case raised a bigger question. What happens when a country disagrees with an international legal decision? Should international law always be followed, or does power matter more than legal rulings? These are questions that continue to shape international politics today. Could there possibly be a war? This is the question everyone wants answered. The honest answer? Nobody knows. Most experts believe that countries involved want to avoid a full scale conflict. The economic costs would be enormous. However, tensions remain high. A collision between ships, a military misunderstanding, a political crisis. Any of these could increase tensions dramatically. History has shown that major conflicts sometimes begin not because leaders want war, but because situations spiral out of control. And that's why many governments are closely monitoring developments in the region. The bigger picture. The South China Sea isn't really just about a sea. It's about power, it's about international law, it's about trade, and it's about national security. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the kind of world we want to live in. A world where disputes are resolved through diplomacy, or a world where the strongest countries simply just get their way. That's the debate happening beneath the surface of this conflict. And that's all for today's episode of Gen Z Unfiltered. What do you think? Should international law be the final authority in disputes like this? Or is power the reality of global politics? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. I'm Aranama and thank you so much for listening. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the most important stories in the world aren't happening on land, they're happening at sea. See you next time on Gen Z Unfiltered.